Today, we welcome to the Global Citizenship Education interview series Emily Bernstein. Emily Bernstein is the head of the Geography Department at St. Edward's School, Oxford. She's responsible for designing the geography curriculum for students from year 9 to year 13, managing the department budget and overseeing school trips and enrichment activities. Emily also leads the school's geography outreach programs, including partnerships with regional primary and secondary schools and the Oxfordshire Geographical Association lectures. Her research examines global citizenship education in secondary education in the UK, with a particular focus on 16 plus provision, exploring the A level and IB programs across both state and independent schools. So, Emily, very welcome to the Global Citizenship Education interview series. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
A pleasure. So, the Global Citizenship Education interview series welcomes perspectives on global citizenship and global citizenship education, with a particular interest on how global citizenship is practically implemented within educational institutions and beyond theoretical perspectives, discussions on how we can create and shape pedagogy in terms of teaching and promoting global citizenship. And so the first question is a challenging one. And the question is, what is global citizenship education, in your opinion, and how potentially is related to your academic journey and life journey?
Sure. I mean, it's a huge question, I think, and obviously a contested one. And I think the way that I've always approached the idea of what is global citizenship education is to sit in the complexity of what it actually means, and embrace that complexity rather than trying to define it in a certain way. So I think the way that I've kind of always come at global citizenship is from a self-reflective point of view.
Mhm.
Um, if we look at the history of global citizenship education, I think, you look at the turn of the century and you think about the idea that there's discussions going on about the complexity and existing beyond the nation state and what that actually means and entails. And then obviously it's taken lots of different directions. And I think the direction that I have potentially been gravitating towards, I think, the most famous and most well cited obviously go down a kind of critical global citizenship route. But I think we're moving now to the understanding that there's these Karen Pashby uses the word interfaces. There's these interactions and these communications between different types of global citizenship. And for me, that's grounded in a sense of self-reflection, of um, really looking at things in different ways, and accepting that from a practical point of view, there's the coexistence between lots of different types of global citizenship within practice. And I think from my own perspective is my research really is grounded in how do we take the theoretical understandings and the different movements in global citizenship, and how does it work in practice? What does
Mm.
that mean for teachers? What does that mean actually on the ground in secondary schools? And how do we navigate through that? So I think I'm interested in really understanding how different things, different elements of global citizenship actually work with one another, but always grounded in that sense of self-reflection of appreciating that our path, our perspective on things might be different and might be questioned, and that's okay. And kind of having the humility to say, well, this is a different way of looking at things. And
Yeah,
that's
that
kind of where I'm
flexibility,
landed.
that diversity that brings in this conceptualization of global citizenship is very, very important. You mentioned Professor Pashbai, Karen Pashbai, who, as you might know, was part of the initial guest speakers here at the Global Citizenship Education interview series. We had a series of guests, an expert on the topic. And you're right, she uses the term interfaces, or we could also say strong interconnectivity between a diversity of theoretical perspectives on global citizenship, more transformative, more critical, ethical. So it's very important, and I agree with you that we discuss global citizenship education from a variety of perspectives. And in relation to this, I want to ask a follow-up question regarding the specifics of your research. So you're looking into global citizenship education in secondary education in the UK, specifically focused on 16 plus provision. Just for our audience, what is exactly a 16 plus provision?
Okay, so I'm specifically looking at the type of curricula, the offerings that are in place for 16 to 18-year-olds within
Hmm.
school. And specifically, I look at the International Baccalaureate versus the A level, which is the more kind of traditional route within the UK that the majority of students will follow through. Um, so the research really looks at the components of the actual curriculum, the taught material, but it also looks at the pedagogical practices, how teachers actually deliver those programs,
Mm.
and then wider in terms of what are the co-curricular provisions within the school, how do schools both interpret and then enact different forms of global citizenship. So I think what was really important for me is that I didn't want to look at a specific form of global citizenship. It was about
Yeah.
an evolutionary piece of research that was taking schools where they're at, meeting schools where they're at, and seeing actually how there is both conscious and subconscious enactments of different types of global
Mhm.
citizenship within the classroom that teachers do sometimes intentionally, but not always, and how they navigate that through the curriculum that they deliver. So as I said, it's focused specifically on the IB and the A level, as opposed to all the other different
Mm.
opportunities that there are.
Right. And what are two or three key insights that you are prepared to share with our audience? So far, I guess your research is probably ongoing,
Mhm.
developing or what you already found. But if you were asked to share a couple of insights, or areas that you find particularly challenging or interesting, that would be very, very interesting for our audience here at the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series.
Sure. So I think what's interesting about my research is that in terms of research that's gone on and in terms of empirical research, A, there's not a huge amount of empirical research, and B, there's not a huge amount of empirical research in the UK. There is some, um, but I think in terms of what I found, actually, there is I like to live in in a positive land, and I think what I found both in IB and A level settings, and
Mhm.
I think what's really important because we have quite a segregated and bifurcated system within the UK of the state versus the independent, and I'd love it to not be quite so separate. But I think there's some positivity, and actually multiple different layers, multiple different forms of global citizenship are in action in these schools.
Yeah.
They are complex, evolving creatures, and a lot of previous research says that the majority of global citizenship education in action in schools sits in a kind of cultural cosmopolitan kind of realm of global citizenship. And I found that yes, that is true, but there are glimmers of critical and potentially post-critical forms. Now, they might be framed within a kind of cultural cosmopolitan um bigger framework, but actually there are elements that we are seeing in the way that teachers are speaking to me, having conversations about the creation of a state as a made up concept of questioning single story narratives in English, of layering cultural perspectives, of looking at the history of trigonometry in maths rather than assuming that it's Pythagorean theorem, actually looking at the history of things and really trying to break down some of those meta narratives. And I think what I found fascinating is that that is happening, that the
Mm.
curriculum is changing and we are moving towards at least more critical forms of global citizenship. And I think that's a really promising sign that potentially we haven't seen. And I think the other thing is that whilst the IB naturally pertains towards this because of the origins of the IB,
Mhm.
it's not beyond the realms of a very British system like the A level that it can and it it is being enacted. But fundamentally, it's grounded in those teachers, and it's teachers making intentional decisions to practice global citizenship and to interpret global citizenship for their students. Um, so I think there is a certain amount of facilitation that goes on with the
Yeah.
curriculum, but it really is those individuals that are making a conscious effort to do things that are accessing the more critical and the potentially post-critical. Um, I think if I think about A-level politics, for example, that there is now a section in A-level politics that looks specifically at ecological and environmental justice and looking at deep ecology. And as a geographer myself, drawing on things like the Gaia principle from James Lovelock, which actually is not a new idea, but it's about actually recentering the environment. The fact
Mm.
that that's happening
Recontextualizing. Yeah, definitely.
yeah,
Definitely.
contextualizing things. And actually, that's a really fascinating turn in terms of what is happening in the curriculum
Yeah.
in a way that perhaps we haven't found elsewhere before.
Absolutely. No, I mean, very interesting what you're saying right now. The idea that the notion of global citizenship education pushes pedagogues, teachers, educators to recontextualize and, in a way, reframe certain ideas critically because of the changing times and the super complexities of our societies nowadays. And I want to ask you a follow-up question. You lead the geography department's education pathway from year 9 to year 13 at St. Edward's School, Oxford. And how does your role intersect with the notions of global citizenship education?
It's an interesting one because I think geography as a subject is really at the forefront of what we do, for better or for worse. Historically, social science has always taken the forefront of in practice. But I think what I do is that global citizenship factors into every single day practice, from the use of language that we try to use within the classroom to the content that we deliver.
Yeah.
Um, I think I make conscious choices, whether it's in a question of, well, how did that language affect this? Or perspectives. We do a lot of things, from even with the younger ones, looking at deforestation and protection of land. And, I push them in terms of, okay, well, what role do Indigenous communities play, and what knowledges can we take from Indigenous communities, because we don't know the answers.
Yeah.
So when I'm designing the curriculum, what I'm trying to do is reframe and recenter their sense of knowledge and sense of power, and decenter sometimes that Western perspective, or at least make them question it, and kind of think about, well, what does it mean to
Mm.
be from the UK or Western? I read a book recently. It's actually by an ancient historian. She's a professor at the University of Oxford, How the World Made the West, and
Yeah.
actually getting students to really unpick what we mean. So it factors into our pedagogical practice every single day,
Mm.
um, which is a lovely thing to explore and experiment, but it's in conjunction with having to sit in a policy scape that is complex, that in a
Mm.
history of education in the UK is extraordinarily complex. So
Absolutely.
we do it within the framework of the teaching standards of fundamental British values and whatever that means. So it's very complicated, but I feel like geography is at the forefront of actually driving global citizenship in multiple different directions. So that's what I try to do with our curriculum.
And definitely, geography and citizenship are strongly interrelated.
Yeah.
Um, all right, so we are heading toward the end of this very interesting conversation, Emily, and I want to ask you a final question. It's a challenging one, but all our international guests would go this challenging question. And the question is, how would you define global citizenship education using three keywords, and why did you choose these three keywords?
Um, it is very difficult. I think I would lead, as I said at the start, with self-reflection, the ability to self-reflect.
Self-reflection.
And I think self-reflection on who we are, on what our perspectives are, and have the ability and the
Hmm.
humility would be my second word, to
Interesting.
accept and to break down potentially our prejudices and accept other knowledge frameworks, in a way that is about discussion and about being open. And then I think the third one would be empathy, really deep appreciation and empathy to
Mm.
look at things in different ways. An example might be, for example, I just read a book about finding the mother tree and about mycorrhizal networks and the connection between
Mm.
older trees and younger trees, and actually understanding that we don't know ecological networks in the way that we think that we do,
Mm.
and we're finding new things all the time that we can learn from. So I think the thing for me is, yes, self-reflection, humility, empathy, and understanding that our frame of reference changes all the time.
All the time,
Much
very
like
dynamic.
culture, exactly, it's very dynamic. Much as culture is never finished, I don't think we are ever finished in terms of what we know and where that comes from.
All right, excellent. Very interesting conversation, engaging, mix of practical and theoretical perspectives. Emily Bernstein, the head of the geography department at St. Edward's School in Oxford. Thank you very much for joining the Global Citizenship Education interview series.
Super. Thank you so much.